Members of Congress, I have the high privilege and distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
Thank you. Thank you. We should remember that today's world presents not just dangers, not just threats, it presents opportunities to boost American exports, support American jobs. And tonight I'm announcing that we will launch talks on a comprehensive transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the European Union, because trade that is fair and free across the Atlantic supports millions of good-paying American jobs.
Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. Welcome to Lough Erne. I always said that the whole point of this meeting in Lough Erne is to fire up our economies and drive growth and prosperity around the world, to do things that make a real difference to people's lives. And there is no more powerful way to achieve that than by boosting trade.
Today is a special day for the relation between the European Union and the United States. Today we announced we will start negotiations of a comprehensive transatlantic trade and investment partnership agreement.
TTIP will be the greatest transfer of power from people to big business that we have seen in a generation.
Who really has the power here?
TTIP is part of a larger scheme to redefine how society works and redefine it in favour of corporations.
It's a battle. It's a war.
It would completely undermine our moral and economic and social imperative to wean ourselves off fossil fuels.
Well, TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and it's this comprehensive trade deal which is being negotiated in secret between the European Commission on the one side, representing the 28 member states of Europe, and the US government on the other side.
Well, the Green Party is opposed to the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership because we think it's effectively a takeover by corporate power. And then there are also elements within it which we think potentially become an attack on environmental standards, public services, transparency, data protection. There's a whole list of things within it about which we have concerns.
These negotiations can be a game changer. We are already each other's biggest trade and investment partners. Strengthening this relationship will bring more jobs, more growth to Europe and the United States.
Well, the claim that's made for TTIP is that as the US and the European Union are coming out of this long recession caused by the global economic crisis from 2008, TTIP will somehow boost our economies and create more jobs, create more growth. Unfortunately, all the evidence is against them, because in the past, when we've had those promises made for free trade agreements, in fact, the result has been the opposite. You take that, for example, with the Uruguay rounds of World Trade talks, which finished in 1994 and gave birth to the World Trade Organization. Huge claims were made as to what those talks would bring, particularly for the poorest countries. And in the end, the opposite turned out to be the case. But most recently, of course, between the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, between the US, Canada, and Mexico.
In a few moments, I will sign the North American Free Trade Act into law. NAFTA will tear down trade barriers between our three nations. It will create the world's largest trade zone and create 200,000 jobs in this country by 1995 alone. The environmental and labor side agreements negotiated by our administration will make this agreement a force for social progress as well as economic growth.
And in the end, you saw a massive loss of jobs in the US and a huge transfer of jobs out of Mexico, which is the one country which was promised to get so much benefit from NAFTA. So the claims made for these free trade agreements never stack up.
We at the European Commission are convinced that this is good for Europe, that it will result in more jobs, more growth, and can help us out of the economic crisis. And by the way, that would be good news for Europe, but good news for the rest of the world as well.
Even if you got the growth, there's no guarantee whatsoever that that actually makes that growth is then going to be redistributed in any way whatsoever. And I think that a lot of the job sort of promises from it, it's really difficult to see where that's coming from, because we're also looking at a whole set of other problems about, are we going to see jobs relocated towards the States?
2 million extra jobs, more choice and lower prices in our shops. We're talking about what could be the biggest bilateral trade deal in history.
As part of broader growth strategies in both our economies, it would support hundreds of thousands of jobs on both sides of the ocean.
I think that there's absolutely no guarantee that you get any job development with this whatsoever, even if you get increased economic growth.
The potential economic gains for the European Union are estimated at around 120 billion euros a year. And the real beauty of this deal is that it will offer real returns of around 545 euros per average household in Europe, almost for free. This makes it the cheapest stimulus package one can imagine.
I think one of the most dishonest aspects of TTIP are the claimed benefits that are supposedly going to flow from it. The European Commission produced a study put together by a group called CEPR in London, which supposedly did an in-depth projection of the benefits of what TTIP would bring us. And there's this figure which they continue to quote, which is 119 billion euros will be the extra growth that the European Union's economy will have. But in fact, if you look more closely, that 119 billion euros is in 2027. So it's after 10 years of TTIP being in place. It also refers to the most optimistic predictions. That's the best you're going to get. The low-end predictions are 22 billion euros. And when you spread that out between 500 million people, you're talking about really trivial additions. And in fact, even that 119 billion euros over 10 years, that's a 0.5% extra GDP growth, but that's over 10 years. So the extra GDP growth per year, on average, is 0.05%, which, given the limits of modelling, is actually pretty close to zero.
Even before the negotiations had started, the European Commission had undertaken a strong process of consulting business, asking business what were the type of trade barriers that business wanted to see removed. And the EU asked European businesses what barriers they wanted to see removed in the US. The US asked US corporations what barriers they'd like to see removed in Europe. And then what happened is the EU and the US business groups made common cause, and together they started putting in joint submissions saying, these are the sorts of things that we want to see removed. We want to see removal of environmental standards, of labour standards. We want to see an end to all of the regulations and the food safety rules, for example, which are preventing us from maximising our profits.
Something like 93%, I think it is, of the consultation meetings that the Commission had held were actually with business. And partly you can understand that. This is an agreement which, of course, is actually going to affect international trade. These companies will be affected. On the other hand, that's an enormous imbalance. And particularly when you don't necessarily see the results of, what those consultation procedures were saying and what people were asking for. So there is a real concern that from the very beginning, this has been about facilitating business rather than actually protecting consumer interests or environmental rights or anything else.
A large amount of the problem here is structural. I mean, so say if you want to go and talk to the people at the European Commission, largely their door will be open. There are blocks for all groups. But in terms of who's got the resources to actually do that, that's when it becomes a problem. And then, because the people with the biggest resources are large business groups or businesses themselves, so they get the most access.
When the European Union had done all of that preliminary research, they then created the mandate for their negotiations. So the mandate was given strictly from business, and then they undertake consultations with trade unions, with civil society organisations, with consumer groups to say to them, well, this is what we're doing, now let's see what you think about it. So that's why the negotiation of TTIP is directed by business for business.
Well, the negotiations so far have been almost completely intransparent. The fact that they've flicked a few crumbs of information in our general direction doesn't really hide the fact that we don't know what's going on. Now, they say that they're being more transparent than they've ever been before, but they're starting from a very low base. I mean, they're starting from almost complete secrecy, and they're now just opening the door very slightly.
We were shocked to find out that the chief EU negotiator had sent a letter to his US counterpart right at the beginning of the negotiations saying that there would be a 30-year ban on public access to the key documentation behind the TTIP negotiations.
From a democracy perspective, this is an agreement that will affect all of us, and it's imperative that we do actually know what the people who are negotiating on our behalves ultimately are saying, and what they're saying our position as the EU is. And as it stands right now, we have sort of general overviews posted on the European Commission websites, but in terms of the nitty-gritty detail, we're not privy to that, and it's proven to be a problem.
There was a question, why can't the national ministers or the national audience, the citizens, why can't they have all the papers even before you go into a bargaining session?
It's a very political question. It has never been done like that in the past.
And they claim that, well, of course, it's not possible to release practically anything because these are negotiations and we can't reveal our hand to the other side. They keep using this kind of metaphor of a poker game that you can't show your cards. But what they won't address is the fact that when you play poker, you put your cards down on the table one by one. And so those cards are already revealed. And the same is true of negotiations. Once you have made an offer, once you have tabled a document, then it is no longer secret. The Americans can see it. So there's no reason why the European Commission should not publish all tabled documents because they are not secret anymore. Now, you might argue that the ones that they're keeping for future negotiations, in other words, in the next round, should be secret. But even that isn't true because there are good precedents for massive negotiations conducted completely in the open. WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, actually publishes all of its documents all at once. It broadcasts live all of the negotiations. It is the most transparent process you can imagine, and yet they manage to negotiate global agreements on trade. So the idea that you can't possibly negotiate openly is just not true. It's just that's what they want to do. And the reason they want to do that is because they know that if people could see what's being negotiated, then there'd be riots in the street.
Well, in terms of access to documents, it's a very small number of people currently who can actually see those documents from the European Parliament. I think it's been about 13, 15 members up until now. I haven't been one of the privileged few. And it also works on the basis that you go in, it's a private reading room, you're not supposed to really be taking notes, you're not supposed to tell people afterwards what it is you've seen.
We are all here to denounce the secrecy, the lack of transparency and the lack of democracy around the TTIP negotiation.
Very recently, the Commission actually proposed some changes to this, new Commissioner Malmström in charge, in terms of increasing transparency. So now there'll be the possibility for all members of the European Parliament to visit the private room one by one. We have visions of a huge queue snaking around the European Parliament, but that will go ahead. She's also said that she intends to make more documents public.
The Commission will publish more of the proposals that we have made to the United States for the chapters of an eventual agreement. They will be online for everybody to examine.
It shows that change is possible when you put the pressure on.
The next big battle in trade It is a battle about norms, standards and regulations, It's not any longer about tariffs. This is the defensive approach. The real approach, the one that we should have, is one on norms, standards and regulations.
One of the key things about TTIP is it's not a traditional trade agreement, which is just about reducing border tariffs between goods. TTIP explicitly reaches behind the border and sets as its agenda a lowering of standards, because those standards provide a problem, a non-tariff barrier for business. And one of the key areas which has been identified as being open to this is food. Because of course in the European Union there are completely different standards and regulations pertaining to food production from what exists in the United States. So for example, in the US, 70% of all processed food in the supermarkets contains genetically modified ingredients. Now in Europe there's been complete resistance to having genetically modified food. And so the US business looks over at Europe as a market which is blocked to it. Similarly with beef production, 90% of all beef produced in the US is produced using bovine growth hormones. Again, those growth hormones are banned in Europe because they've been found to be carcinogenic. TTIP offers the United States, and particularly the big producers in US agribusiness, a chance to challenge European Union rules. And the US Secretary of State for Agriculture has said quite explicitly that the EU approach to food safety has to be revised. And that's why people in Europe are up in arms saying, well, it's up to us to decide what we wish to eat. It's up to us to decide the level of pesticides that we will tolerate in food. It's up to us to decide whether or not we want to have genetically modified ingredients.
If we're trying to promote organic farming, we think that that's more labour intensive, we think it's a better use of land, it's better for soil quality, pesticide reduction, all of that side of things. And then we're basically looking at how do we open up further for industrial farming from the States. You really have to wonder about where is the joined up thinking going on here. And we also know that from the state side, there are concerns that some of the states have, Buy American clauses. And again, they're going to be wondering, well, we're trying to do sort of local production. We're trying to keep jobs here. And we're opening our markets to the European Union.
At a political level, it's quite easy to find what the sort of asks are from the EU and the US and what they've said the red lines are.
At the outset of this negotiation, we identified regulatory and standards-related issues as a priority focus for the TTIP. This is a challenging area to address, but one that holds great promise. We both agree that eliminating costs and other barriers due to unnecessary regulatory divergences can produce substantial returns in terms of increased trade and investment.
So when it comes to food safety, the US would quite like the EU to adopt their way of doing things so that, for example, that they could then export GM food to the EU without restrictions, hormone-treated beef, chlorine chicken, all the headline issues that you hear about. And then the EU, for what would they like from the US? One of the main things they'd like is access to their public procurement markets at a state level, so EU companies can bid on those. They'd also like the US to open up its energy markets to export more oil, gas, shale oil, because there's certain restrictions on that at the moment. And then they'd also quite like financial regulation to be on the table to sort of harmonise financial regulations. So that's at the political sort of headline level. And on both sides, the US and the EU, they've both said, no, we will not give in to those because they're the things that are sort of caught headlines,
We are not lowering standards in TTIP. Our standards on consumer protection, on the environment, on data protection, and on food are not up for negotiation.
The worry is that actually when it comes down to it, when they start negotiating, really getting to the depths of negotiation, compromises will have to be made.
On financial services, yes, we are of the opinion that it should be part of the negotiations.
When it comes to financial services, it's quite interesting because it's actually the US regulations which were introduced after the financial crisis in 2008 that British banks and German and French banks are trying to undermine. And that means it's not always about higher standards in the European Union and lower standards in the US. When it comes to banking, it's the City of London and the big German and French banks which are trying to undermine US provisions.
The EU financial regulation is actually weaker than the US is, and the US don't want it on the table because they fear that it would lead to a lowering of their standards, which is interesting because this is the thing that the EU and US say isn't going to happen in TTIP, yet the US have specifically removed a big aspect from the negotiations, fearing that will happen. But the EU are pushing for it, along with the UK government specifically would like it.
But when you talk about the EU pushing for it, you have to understand that the US financial services have a great deal of say in Brussels. So the American Chamber of Commerce is a major force in Brussels policy. So US banks want that regulation brought down as much as EU banks.
What we aim to achieve in TTIP is that these regulatory agencies coordinate more closely with each other, so that where safety levels are similar, double testing and double inspections can be avoided in future to save companies money.
So what we've seen from the leaked chapters and sort of leaked information is what they're pushing for is a system of mutual recognition. So that is where you say, look, our ways of regulating are different. However, we believe they achieve the same outcome ultimately. So if a product is made in the US under that regulatory system, if we've said that we accept that that regulatory system has produced a sufficient outcome that we believe that product to be safe, that can now be imported here without having to be looked at again by our regulators. That's what the EU are pushing for, especially we've seen a leaked food safety draft proposal. So that would mean that when it comes to importing and exporting food, we would say in the EU, accept that the US regulators have checked the food over there, they've verified it's safe, so when it comes over to the EU, we won't have to do as many port of entry inspections because they cost a lot of money. So it'll save us money and be great for everyone. And that's completely fine if the systems are the same and equivalent. But we know, for example, in food safety, there aren't one there that they're not. And that can also be applied to other sectors such as chemicals. They're just, the systems are different and they result in tangibly different outcomes.
One of the key differences between the regulatory regimes in the European Union and in the USA is that we in Europe base our regulations on what is called the precautionary principle. And the idea of the precautionary principle is basically, if you can't prove that a chemical substance is safe for introduction into commercial usage, then you can't introduce it. In the USA, exactly the opposite pertains. So if the government can't prove beyond all reasonable doubt that a chemical is unsafe, then it's okay for business to introduce that into commercial usage. And that leads to disparities, for example, in cosmetics. In cosmetics, in the European Union, there are 1,300 substances banned for use in cosmetics. In the States, it's just 12.
We've had EU Commission officials saying to us privately that, look, there is nothing positive in this agreement for the so-called REACH directive, which is about what chemicals are allowed in the European Union at all. That we really need to keep a very close eye on what's happening. And one of the things that's also being put on the table is this sort of regulatory committee. We'll look at certain of this regulation, look at what might be changed, what might not. And, there are a lot of us that have invested a lot of time. A lot of public interest has gone into getting the legislation that we already have, for example, on chemicals. And we don't want to see that undermined in corporate interests.
So the idea that during the negotiations we could change REACH, that seems to be out of the scope of these negotiations. But I think we should have the courage to have a fresh look at what we have been doing in the past as well. But that, I believe, is really part of the living agreement, the living part of the agreement.
We had a leak a year ago about something called a regulatory council. And the idea behind this is that in addition to signing TTIP now, there would be this body that lives on beyond it that would have a regulatory role for the transatlantic space. And whenever a new regulation in the US or the EU were proposed, this regulatory council will actually have the right to look at it and possibly veto it on the grounds that it would damage transatlantic trade. So it is placing transatlantic trade above all other considerations. So you couldn't bring in an environmental regulation, however laudable it might be, if it caused profits to diminish in transatlantic trade, because the regulatory council would have the power to say, this is not good for trade.
Trade considerations often run contrary to public health considerations, because trade considerations are largely just considered as, will this cost businesses more to do in the short term? You know, when environmental public health policy is more what needs to be done to protect the population's health or to protect the environment in the long term. So those pressures sort of come head to head here, and we just think that with this proposed regulatory cooperation council where businesses will be able to lobby, we think that it will probably lead to a weakening going forward. And at a time of planetary emergency where we've got to address the climate crisis, we've got to be bringing in needed regulation to address market failure effectively, massive market failure that is climate change. Having further obstructions to this and further sort of leverage to be used against this and formalising the lobbying process for big companies is just a step in the wrong direction.
The way that regulation is made if it's made in the US, is that there's really big business input right the way through, which blocks regulation most of the time, and a harmonising of that methodology with ours with theirs would be really dangerous for us.
It's also worth pointing out that there are many US groups who are very opposed to TTIP for exactly the same reasons, that they've been trying to get better standards, higher standards on organic food, on environmental protection, on endocrine disruptors, and they see that all of that hard work could be undercut by TTIP.
The European Union considers that it would be important to develop an agreed framework on this issue within TTIP. We continue to engage with our American friends and have reiterated the importance of a restriction-free environment for the supply of energy and raw materials.
The EU are explicitly using these trade talks to push the US to reduce their restrictions on exporting crude oil, natural gas, coal, effectively all forms of fossil fuels. And we sort of think, you know, at a time of planetary emergency, you know, a climate crisis, the idea that our governments or our representatives in Europe are pushing for measures that would ultimately lock us into fossil fuel dependency for the coming decades is outrageous.
Another of the key arguments that the proponents of TTIP are making in its favour is that somehow by signing this deal it will make Europe less dependent upon Russian energy resources, particularly oil and gas. And that's clearly very important for countries like Germany, which are still very reliant on imports of Russian oil and gas. And the idea is that in the US, unless you have a free trade agreement with another country, there are very strict rules governing whether or not you can export gas and oil to that country. So if we had a TTIP agreement, then it would unlock the door to huge quantities of crude oil and of natural gas from the US. And of course, we know that that oil is predominantly now coming down from the tar sands in Canada at huge environmental cost, refined in the US and then exported over to Europe.
Tar sands themselves, you know, they're hugely destructive. They've effectively dug up in Canada an area the size of Florida. And if we're importing more oil from the US, which is tar sand oil that's been transported from Canada through the US, we're increasing the demand for that. And that means that there will be more tar sand extraction in Canada, which is more environmental damage in Canada.
In terms of the gas, it's a massive expansion of fracking. So it's basically shale gas, which will be transported over to the European Union.
So it's completely wrong of them to say that this agreement won't affect the environment, when one of their most explicit demands has clear, obvious links to doing just that. And also, I mean, this gas, it will struggle to compete on EU markets at current prices, because whilst US shale might be cheap within the US internal market, once you pay for the transportation and liquefaction, the price comes up a lot. So it's not going to result in cheaper energy prices for us either, which is another one of their arguments. But they've also ignored the fact that to import all this gas to Europe, which they hope will reduce our dependency on Russia, it's going to take 10, 15 years to do. The infrastructure is just not there to transport the gas across America to its ports, to then liquefy it, to then ship it over to the EU, where it then has to be then from the EU ports sent around Europe. The problem there is that you then lock in that infrastructure, because if governments, companies invest to create this infrastructure so that it can happen, it means that we're locked into that for the next 50 years effectively. We're sort of locking ourselves into decades more of fossil fuel dependency in the EU at a time when we desperately need to be weaning ourselves off it.
One of the other key concerns about TTIP is that it threatens to open up public services to the private sector in areas where it hasn't been able to gain access up until now. TTIP does include medical services, education services, postal services, transport services, and wastewater services. That's clear. We know that, and the European Commission has confirmed it. Within the UK context, one of the key focuses has been on health, and particularly the National Health Service, which remains the jewel in the crown of our public services. And that's why people are so outraged when they hear that health is on the table in TTIP, and that the NHS is squarely in the focus of the talks. And part of the problem here, of course, is we've already seen some privatisation of the NHS, particularly in the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, where all contracts have to be opened up to the private sector. And we're now seeing more and more private providers taking over key frontline services within the NHS.
There are a lot of assurances being given about public services being safe from TTIP, because the public concern is so great, especially in this country, about the NHS. With public services, you're dealing with a lot of different levels of law. You're dealing with UK law, EU law, and trade law. You're also dealing with different levels of spin and different levels of lying as well. So it's a lawyer's dream, really. And that means a lot of things would not be defined until they're tested in law, really, and how good the lawyers are. So there's no real safety for public services.
The concern that there really is about what TTIP does, and if it's like the agreement with Canada, is it puts in place, as it were, effectively a flaw that says the current state of what's privately provided for in the National Health Service at the moment is where we start. You can't go back. So it freezes what we have. And therefore, if there's a change of government in this country that wants to change that in the National Health Service and say, no, we want less private, more public, if TTIP's there, you can't do that.
Data privacy is going to be one of the big battlegrounds for TTIP, because even though the EU says that there will be nothing to do with data protection and data privacy in TTIP, the Americans are adamant that data must flow freely across the Atlantic, because the whole point of a trade agreement is you're supposed to make it easier for things to flow, be it goods or data. So their view is that you've got to have free flow of that information, but that means that the European privacy laws are essentially going to be dismantled, because you can't allow free flow across the Atlantic without ignoring the really quite rigorous European Union's data privacy. Now, in the wake of Edward Snowden's revelations about the NSA's massive surveillance of European citizens, it's clearly not appropriate for our data to go across the Atlantic when the NSA will have access to it just by default. And so there was a big battle going on around that issue. In terms of things like copyright and patents, which are very important areas, as far as copyrights are concerned, we know that a recent treaty with Canada, CETA, between the EU and Canada, originally was going to have some very strong copyright measures in it, which have been pushed by the European Commission. And Canada actually fought back and said, we don't want those. But that shows that the European Commission is pushing for even stronger copyright terms. The trouble is, when they start talking to America, which likes copyright even more, the danger is you may have really extreme copyright terms, and those include things like having your ISP spy on you and bringing in enhanced penalties, even for just allegedly sharing files online. On the issue of patents, we have other indications about what might be done, because there is a further trade agreement, which is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is basically between America and Pacific Rim countries, which is a kind of sister agreement to TTIP. And in that, they are pushing for some very extreme extensions of patenting. Obviously, pharmaceutical patents are of great interest to America with its big pharma companies. They want to make patents longer and stronger. Again, the European Union would probably be interested in doing that too, because we have big pharma companies here. But they even want to do things like allowing the patenting of surgical techniques or allowing animals to be patented. So the danger is America might start pushing for those kind of extensions to patentability. One of the most contentious issues of TTIP is something called investor-state dispute settlement, which sounds really incredibly boring. It's an old idea that goes back decades, and it was brought in when Western countries started investing in developing countries in Africa and South America. And there was a fear that investors might put money into a country only to see an unstable government march in with machine guns and expropriate factories or basically steal the investors' investment. And therefore, because the local judiciary was regarded as unsafe in those kind of countries, they set up a kind of parallel court system, a tribunal of 3 lawyers who would adjudicate whether a country had in fact expropriated an investment.
It grants foreign companies the power to bypass domestic courts, which is a power that nobody else has, and they get to challenge national governments for any public policy decision, irrespective of whether they've got a contract with the government or with any local government at all. This means that governments which are preparing to introduce new legislation or new rules governing the operations of foreign investors will be looking over their shoulders and thinking, we can't introduce that, because when another country introduced it, then they were sued as a result. And this means that you constantly see the chilling effect of ISDS in many of the different areas of public health, environmental safety, food safety, and other key areas of our social and environmental life. And that, again, is why ISDS is profoundly anti-democratic.
ISDS is interesting from a UK perspective because we do already have quite a few of these ISDS agreements, but we don't have them with any country whose companies invest very much in the UK. So we've largely, UK companies have used it as a tool to beat up on smaller countries. The UK government commissioned a study from LSE just to look at what the implications of having ISDS in TTIP would be for the UK. The 4 main findings were ISDS in TTIP would be of no economic benefit to the UK. It would be of no political benefit to the UK. It would be of some economic cost to the UK, and it would pose some political risk to the UK. So effectively, the conclusion was, don't do this.
So the best way to understand what ISDS means in practice is to look at some of the cases which have been brought under previous trade agreements which exist in other parts of the world. Now, in 2011, we had the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, and the huge meltdown in the nuclear reactor there led to massive protests in Germany. The German government cancelled the nuclear program as of 2022. Vattenfall, the Swedish company, which was operating 2 German power plants, is now suing the German people for deciding it doesn't want to have nuclear power anymore. Philip Morris, the tobacco multinational, is suing the Australian government for billions of dollars in lost profits because the Australian government introduced new rules requiring all tobacco to be marketed in plain packaging. And Philip Morris is saying that means we're not going to be able to sell as many cigarettes in the future, and that means that our profits have somehow been undermined, and we get to sue you for compensation. Achmea, a Dutch company, has sued Slovakia for reversing a very unpopular health privatisation because it meant that Achmea, the company, would no longer be able to profit from it. Veolia, the French multinational, is suing the Egyptian government for daring to raise the minimum wage. And in time, in case after case after case of these, you see that the country has to spend millions and millions of dollars fighting off claims, and many times they've actually settled the cases out of court and rescinded the public policies which had caused the problem in the first place.
Another very important case, which I think will actually prove to be one of the most dangerous, is that in Canada, a company called Eli Lilly applied for some patents on drugs. And these were initially granted, as they often are, and then later, when it was reviewed, it was decided they didn't deserve those patents. They have now turned to a free trade agreement called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, to claim that Canada has indirectly expropriated its future profits by virtue of not giving it patents. So you can see how ISDS acts as a real brake on bringing in laws to the benefit of the public. Effectively, it's a ratchet. You can only have new laws that benefit companies, because if they don't benefit companies, you get sued.
There's been a huge wave of anger across Europe when people hear about these new powers that would be given to multinational corporations as a result of these new ISDS provisions in TTIP. And that anger led the European Commission to suspend negotiations on the ISDS part of TTIP at the beginning of 2014. And they held a public consultation which they thought would be incredibly complicated and nobody would respond to. In fact, 150,000 responses went into the European Commission, more than they've ever had for any consultation they've ever run in the past. And the vast majority, 99.9%, said, we do not wish to see ISDS in TTIP.
Certainly the public consultation that there was on ISDS brought a huge response. And we saw this really, I think, quite arrogant and dismissive sort of approach from Carol de Gucht, saying, well, look, you know, a lot of these are almost copy-paste. You know, this is just almost just civil society in action. And therefore we'll just take this as it were, as one submission because they're so similar.
Overall, the replies demonstrate a big skepticism against the IST instrument. That is clear. A vast majority of them, 97%, were submitted through various online platforms, pre-formulated negative answers, basically voicing very strong opposition towards TTIP in general, but also on ISDS.
Although it's easy to dismiss the 147,000 people who opposed ISDS as just clicking a button, the fact is 147,000 citizens felt strong enough to click that button, even if that's all they were doing. And that's much more response than we've had to any other Commission or European Union public consultation. So we can't lightly dismiss this.
So now the new European Commission, which came in at the beginning of November 2014, is faced with this stark choice. Do you continue to put ISDS in TTIP, which is what the US wants, and thereby make it unacceptable to the European people? Or do you recognise that actually people do not want to see these type of powers handed over to big business, and therefore you reconsider the mandate of TTIP?
We have frozen this part of the negotiations for the time being. They have said it is important, so somehow we need to address it, but it's too early to say what kind of investment protection we will come up with.
The response was overwhelmingly ISDS out of TTIP. But they're not talking about taking it out of TTIP. They're talking about further changes to make it a bit more acceptable. Juncker, when he first came in, did say that he had doubts about ISDS, but mostly they're just talking about tweaking it.
The new president of the Commission, President Juncker, when he came to our political group to ask us for our votes before he became president, we asked him about ISDS. He was very clear that he wanted disputes settled in the courts, not in private tribunals. This appears to be controversial within his new commission. There are certainly some national governments that have concerns about ISDS, I think not least because this is dealing with American companies, the sheer scale of this, that questions are increasingly being asked about it and about what the rules would be. You know, who decides which cases go to a tribunal mechanism, particularly if this is EU legislation. So there are certainly some questions to be asked. But I think the view that many of us have is that the European Union, the United States, are both blocs that effectively have very strong, robust legal systems, that therefore you do not have unstable governance in the way that you might have with some countries, that investor interests can be protected through the national courts, and that's the way that it should run, so that we have transparency there, so that, you know, we do not have these deals done effectively in private. And I think it's of increasing concern because we're seeing more and more of these cases being brought.
We already have a dry run for TTIP, the EU-Canada trade deal, which has already been concluded and is currently being prepared for voting on. And the ISDS provision already exists in the EU-Canada agreement. And of course, all the US corporations have got offices in Canada, which they could use to be able to sue European countries anyway. That's why we're saying it's not just about saying no to TTIP, but it's also about saying no to the EU-Canada deal as well.
I have started investment negotiations with China. Everybody is going to ask that in any case we have an ISDS in this, you know?
One of the arguments that the European Commission uses in favour of putting ISDS in TTIP is that, yes, they admit it's not really necessary in a deal with America, given that we both have well-developed legal systems, but that we must put it in to set an example for future free trade agreements with other countries. And what they mean by that is a future free trade agreement with China. And so they have this idea that we put ISDS in TTIP, and then when it comes to negotiating a free trade agreement with China, they can say, oh, look, we've got to have ISDS because we had it in TTIP. But what this overlooks is the fact that China is no longer one of those developing countries that we've used ISDS in the past to bully. So what we need to think of is that China is likely to be the dominant partner which is going to use ISDS against Europe and the US, because the investments that China now has in Europe and the US are enormous. And the bigger the investment, the greater the scope for using ISDS to claim this indirect expropriation of investments. And so putting ISDS in any future free trade agreement with China is actually the last thing we should be doing.
There's still no evidence to show that having an ISDS in trade agreements actually increases foreign direct investment into a country. So, and they've been looking for it because it would be very helpful for people trying to make the argument to include it in TTIP, but it's just not there. Brazil doesn't have any ISDS agreements and they don't have any problems attracting foreign direct investments.
Their original idea had been to try to finish the negotiations in 2015, as the US was saying, on one tank of gas, because that means that they will be in advance of the US presidential elections, and also the quicker they can get them through, then it means the less public opposition they'll face. It now looks incredibly unlikely that they would ever be able to get them to a conclusion in 2015.
Trade Commissioner Malmström has just been to London, and she seems to have got the message pretty strongly from here and presumably from the rest of Europe that there's high concern about public services, and in the UK that's particularly the NHS, and high concern about ISDS. So she's talking about more tweaking of both of them.
They've started preparing for texts which will begin to form the basis of TTIP as a deal. And we know that they've made more progress in some areas than in others. For example, the more uncontroversial areas like goods trade, they already have a consolidated text. But we understand that there are other areas where they're having real difficulties, and particularly areas where there are big differences in the regulatory structures between the EU and the US. Areas like financial services, where they're squaring up to each other and refusing to make way. And also on more serious things as to whether or not there should be an energy chapter within TTIP or not. There's quite a complex process before TTIP could come into force. The first thing that has to happen is that the negotiations themselves between the European Commission and the US government have to be concluded. After that, it takes around a year to create what they call the final legal document and then have it translated into all of the languages of the European Union. After that, it has to be passed by the European Council, which is the heads of the 28 member states of the European Union, and then it has to go to the European Parliament for them to vote on it on a yes or no, take it or leave it basis. Then within Europe, it has to go down to each of the national parliaments for ratification, and any one of those parliaments can reject it, and then it gets thrown out.
What's likely to happen with this particular trade agreement is it's likely to end up being what's called a mixed agreement, which means there are some elements in it which will be purely sort of EU competent stuff that the European Union does. Other parts may well be things which are still the responsibility of national governments. So it's a mixed agreement. So it has to be agreed not just amongst the 28 governments, but it's also likely that it will have to be agreed in the 28 national parliaments as well.
One aspect that people may not appreciate is that although the European Parliament will vote on TTIP, it can't change a single comma. It either says yes or it says no. So the idea that the European Commission is spreading that this is an entirely democratic process and at the end of all this, the European Parliament, as representatives of the European public, gets to say whether it likes it or not, is actually completely misleading because they have no power to get rid of the bad bits and keep the good bits.
We don't have the opportunity to amend trade agreements. The only powers that we have technically are to say yes or no.
Ultimately, MEPs will vote yes or no on it, but they will vote dependent on what the consensus is within their base countries and also within their parliamentary groups within the European Union, and that's dictated by you and I and the pressures we put on them.
I think at the moment, if we were voting on something now, I think the agreement would go through. I think that's the likely outcome, but it's not impossible to overturn it. We did it before with the counterfeiting agreement, ACTA, where at the start of the process, Parliament was generally in favour of it. When it came to actually looking at the text, Parliament voted against, so that agreement couldn't go ahead. So it is possible to change things.
There is an aspect that doesn't receive a lot of attention, that once an agreement is through the European Parliament, the Commission can provisionally implement it. So it provisionally implements agreements after the European Parliament gives its assent, but before the member states ratify it, member state parliaments ratify it. And also ISDS kicks in at that stage. So for that provisional time, ISDS is in place, even if it was not finally ratified.
The campaign against TTIP has been building up steam across Europe and in the USA. First and foremost, it was about telling people that there is this thing called TTIP. And now, for any sort of political activist, whether they're in the trade union movement or in food safety or in the green movement, TTIP is a major deal.
One of the most interesting aspects of TTIP has been the growth of the resistance to it. Because TTIP is so all-embracing, it touches every aspect of life, there really is something in it for everyone to hate. And that means that practically every pressure group, every activist group is involved.
So the way we see things going in the world right now, we see that there's an imminent crisis in terms of the climate crisis. We also find that the environment is under attack, in different ways. We've sort of looked at the agreement and we've decided that on the balance of probability, it's going to make it more difficult to address the issues that we're concerned about.
There's some important background to TTIP, which is that a couple of years ago, there was something called the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, which was like a mini TTIP. And this was similarly negotiated behind closed doors, and we didn't really know what was going on. But gradually, through leaks and through generally trying to find out what's going on, people became aware of some bad things in that. It eventually took to the streets of Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, so that when the vote came to the European Parliament, the treaty was actually rejected, which had never been done before, that a treaty that had been signed by everybody else was just thrown out by the European Parliament. And that background to TTIP is very interesting because the European Commission is really frightened that we might see that again for TTIP. Because the MEPs are really the only democratic element. The European Commission has no interest whatsoever in what the people think, and neither have the nation states.
It's really important that people lobby their MPs and MEPs, because that MEP vote will be really important in the European Parliament.
There is a huge and growing public concern about this. And, you know, I think that really means that the Commission is having to engage much more, and Parliament is certainly, you know, really engaging much more on it, which I think is really good for democracy.
This battle that we're now seeing on TTIP, on the EU-Canada deal, and on a range of other free trade agreements is all about the struggle for the future of the rules of the global economy.
Because this is so big, this is 40% of global GDP between the US and the EU, this then becomes the model for trade deals elsewhere. So I think as an elected parliamentarian, I also have to ask if we're looking more and more at ways in which regulation is being dealt with through bilateral committees between countries, rather than through the democratic parliamentary process, who really has the power here? And this is why I think all parliamentarians really should be looking very, very closely at TTIP, because I think it's, you know, it's another of these steps away from a democratic, transparent system.
I think it's important to see TTIP for what it is, which is that it's part of a larger plan by the transnational companies of the world to change the basis on which basically we live, whereby large companies have an ability to shape future legislation in a fundamental way that changes the nature of democracy. So TTIP would really give large companies the ability to both veto unwanted legislation and to push legislation that they want. And this would be done in the name of trade. And the damaging thing is that it's placing trade above all other considerations. For example, there is no account taken of environmental damage. So the fact that a new regulation boosts trade but damages the environment wouldn't really matter. If it boosts trade, it's good. Equally, if you bring in regulations that protect people but cause profits to be lost, that's bad. So it redefines the whole of democracy in terms of profit.
The language is really important because this trade agenda runs on some embedded concepts that we have come to accept, the media particularly have come to accept without question. Trade always being a good thing is one thing to question, especially when you're talking about trade agreements that are not about trade. Free trade sounds wonderful because it's free, but do we really want at this point in time to be shifting the similar goods across the world like this? Competitiveness has been a core concept for overriding labour rights, pushing down wages, etc., etc. Non-discrimination is a widely used term that we've all come to love, but in trade terms, non-discrimination actually means that you have to treat transnational corporations at least as well as you treat domestic companies or small and medium enterprises on the part of the government. So in actual fact, that sort of level playing field usually means that those transnational corporations are advantaged in that situation. Transparency is another one that sounds good to us. We'd love corporations to be more transparent, but the use of transparency in trade agreements means forcing governments at all levels to be really explicit about all their regulations and how they fit together so that corporate lawyers can see straight in and see if there's any inroads there to attack them. Liberalisation is another term. Liberalisation must be good, it sounds free. But liberalisation in goods means that you reduce tariffs when goods cross borders. Liberalisation in services means that you give rights to corporations that come in and invest in services, including financial services. Protectionism is like the dirtiest word in the language, but sometimes we want to protect things. We want to protect jobs, we want to protect wages, for instance, we want to protect the environment. You can see how fundamental these terms have become. Their meaning and what they carry is just not even questioned, they are so embedded. Things are changing all the time. Particularly the spin is changing all the time. So the focus for about the last year has been how good this will be for small and medium enterprise. But it's actually counterintuitive because I think we all know that big corporations tend to squash out small business. They have so many advantages in access to cheap labour, to cheap credit, political influence.
The good news is that the European Commission is really losing the battle for hearts and minds over TTIP. And we know that they know they're losing the battle as well. The more people hear about it, the more people recognise that the European Commission's arguments don't stack up. I think that's why ultimately we will win, because people recognise now that all of the claims made for TTIP are hollow claims and all of the fears and the concerns are real and justifiable.